Humanity learned the wrong lesson from its first contact, and that error took decades to correct. When the envoys from the coalition of elder species arrived in the outer reaches of the Sol system, trailing their lattice of gravity sails and sensor veils, the reaction across Earth was a mixture of awe and immediate, paralyzing humility. The coalition was old beyond the human scale of history, and it did not hide that fact. Their vessels bore scars from wars fought before the first multicellular life crawled across Earth's shallow seas. Their language, when finally translated, carried concepts for time that treated centuries as casual intervals. Their emissaries spoke with the confidence of those who had survived their own mistakes and now believed themselves beyond making new ones. Humanity saw all of this and assumed that age equaled wisdom, that longevity equaled moral authority, and that survival equaled the right to instruct. It was an understandable assumption and a costly one. The coalition did not arrive as conquerors. They did not threaten or demand tribute. They offered guidance, frameworks, and examples. They offered to integrate humanity into a vast network of trade, information exchange, and conflict arbitration. They spoke of stability as the highest virtue and of restraint as the mark of maturity. In return, they asked that humanity accept certain limitations, restrictions on expansion beyond assigned corridors of space, oversight of emerging technologies deemed destabilizing, and participation in a system of collective enforcement against species judged to pose existential risks. These were presented as reasonable conditions, the price of entry into a civilized cosmos. Many human leaders agreed, eager to avoid the mistakes they assumed their ancestors would have made under similar circumstances. For several generations, humanity complied. Colonies spread only where permitted. Research slowed in certain fields, redirected into safer channels. Human fleets were small, largely symbolic, their doctrines shaped by coalition advisors who emphasized deterrence through presence rather than readiness through hardship. Humanity prospered materially, but something quieter began to atrophy. The stories humans told about themselves changed. Exploration became a managed activity. Risk became a problem to be minimized rather than a condition to be endured. The coalition praised this evolution as progress. Humanity, for a time, believed them. The fracture came not from oppression, but from indifference. On the outer edge of coalition space lay a region of star systems inhabited by species that had not yet been deemed worthy of full integration. Among them was a people whose name, translated imperfectly, meant those who grow under heavy skies. Their biology was dense and resilient, adapted to crushing gravity and volatile climates. Their technology was uneven but ingenious, shaped by constant environmental pressure. They occupied a cluster of systems that the coalition had marked for eventual resource reclamation, pending relocation of the inhabitants. The process was expected to take several centuries, and in the meantime, minor losses among the native population were considered acceptable. Stability, after all, was measured on scales larger than individual suffering. Human observers were assigned to the region as part of a routine survey rotation. Among them was a systems engineer named Taek Iosef Klein, a man whose career had been unremarkable by coalition standards and quietly exceptional by human ones. He had been born on a low-orbit habitat where maintenance failures were not abstractions but immediate threats, and he carried into his work an instinctive distrust of systems that assumed ideal conditions. When he saw the early phases of the reclamation process, the automated probes that stripped atmospheres and redirected asteroid flows with no regard for inhabited worlds, he did not see a necessary step in a grand plan. He saw a cascading failure waiting to happen, measured not in machinery but in lives. Klein filed reports. He used the approved channels, the carefully structured language of coalition bureaucracy. He quantified projected casualties. He proposed alternative timelines and mitigation strategies. The responses were polite, thorough, and dismissive. The losses, he was told, fell within acceptable parameters. Intervention would introduce variables that could destabilize neighboring regions. The coalition had survived for millions of years by avoiding such risks. Humanity, as a younger species, was encouraged to learn patience. The moment that changed everything did not involve a dramatic battle or a public declaration. It began with a rescue operation that was never authorized. A survey outpost belonging to those who grow under heavy skies suffered a catastrophic orbital decay after a resource extraction maneuver altered local gravitational balances. Coalition protocols dictated observation and data collection, not interference. Klein watched the telemetry, the slow spiral of the habitat toward a gas giant's crushing atmosphere, and he did what humans had done long before they had interstellar allies. He acted. Using a refitted human transport and a skeleton crew of volunteers, he initiated an unsanctioned intercept. The maneuver pushed their engines beyond rated tolerances, relying on redundancies that coalition designers considered inefficient and unnecessary. The crew improvised, adapting in real time as systems overheated and failed. They latched onto the dying habitat, transferring power, adjusting mass distribution, and bleeding off velocity through a series of brutal, imprecise burns that no coalition simulator would have approved. They saved over 3,000 lives. The coalition response was swift. Klein and his crew were detained. Humanity's representatives were reprimanded. The rescue was framed as a dangerous precedent, an emotional reaction that risked broader instability. The fact that it succeeded was treated as irrelevant, even troubling. Success, in this case, might encourage others to take similar risks. Humanity listened and then slowly stopped agreeing. The trial that followed was not public, but its implications spread. Human delegates began to question coalition assessments, to request independent reviews. They cited not only the rescue, but a growing body of evidence that coalition stability was built on a willingness to accept suffering at the margins. The coalition responded with warnings about the fragility of their order, about the dangers of youthful arrogance. Humanity responded by re-examining its own history, its own survival through eras defined not by perfect planning, but by relentless adaptation. The shift was subtle at first. Human shipyards began producing vessels with thicker hulls, layered redundancies, and systems designed to be repaired under fire rather than avoided altogether. Training doctrines changed, emphasizing endurance, improvisation, and the assumption that plans would fail. Exploration vessels were authorized to make independent decisions in the field, a concept that made coalition overseers visibly uncomfortable. Humanity did not withdraw from the coalition, but it stopped deferring automatically. The elder species noticed. Some were curious, others were alarmed. Humanity's metrics did not make sense by coalition standards. Loss rates in training were higher. Resource expenditures were less efficient. Yet human crews survived scenarios that coalition models predicted as fatal. They operated in regions of space written off as too volatile, too unpredictable. They did not do so recklessly, but they accepted risk as an inherent component of existence rather than an error to be eliminated. The true test came when a threat emerged that the coalition had not faced before. From beyond the mapped periphery, a wave of autonomous constructs entered known space. They were not a species in any traditional sense, but a distributed intelligence housed in self-replicating machines. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They consumed matter and energy to fuel further replication, altering star systems in ways that rendered them lifeless. Coalition archives held records of similar phenomena, but those records ended in failure. In each case, the response had been containment through retreat, sacrificing regions to preserve core stability. This time, Retreat would have meant abandoning dozens of integrated species, including humanity. The coalition convened emergency councils. Projections were grim. The constructs adapted rapidly, learning from each engagement. Coalition fleets, optimized for controlled engagements and minimal losses, found their doctrines inadequate. Every battle fought according to established protocols resulted in unacceptable attrition. The coalition began to discuss strategic withdrawal, the ceding of vast territories to preserve the heart of their civilization. Human representatives listened and then proposed something the coalition found deeply unsettling: a counteroffensive that accepted high risk, relied on decentralized command, and aimed not for immediate stability, but for long-term disruption of the enemy's replication cycles. It involved sacrificing ships deliberately to gather data, luring the constructs into environments that stressed their adaptive algorithms, and deploying technologies that coalition treaties had long discouraged due to their unpredictability. The proposal was rejected. Too dangerous, too chaotic, too human. Humanity acted anyway. Without formal approval, human fleets redeployed to the threatened frontier. They did not announce their intentions, nor did they ask for permission. Their commanders were empowered to make decisions on the fly to exploit fleeting opportunities. When coalition forces attempted to recall them, communications were acknowledged and then ignored. Humanity was not leaving the coalition, but it was no longer asking to be led. The first major engagement was a disaster by coalition metrics. Human losses were severe. Entire task groups were wiped out in brutal, close-range encounters, yet something unexpected happened. The constructs began to behave erratically. Their adaptation cycles slowed, burdened by conflicting data from encounters that did not follow predictable patterns. Human crews did not fight the same way twice. They modified weapons mid-battle, repurposed damaged ships as kinetic weapons, and used environments previously considered unusable. They lost ships, but they learned faster. Coalition observers, forced by circumstance to remain and watch, began to see a pattern. Humanity was not trying to win individual battles. It was teaching the enemy to fail. Each sacrifice was calculated not for immediate gain, but for the information it would force the constructs to process. The humans treated loss not as a sign of failure, but as an investment. When the tide finally turned, it did so abruptly. A human-led operation lured a massive concentration of constructs into a region of unstable spacetime near a collapsed star. Coalition analysts had warned against operating there, citing uncontrollable variables. The humans went anyway. They lost nearly half their force, but the constructs, overwhelmed by conflicting environmental data and aggressive, irrational tactics, suffered a catastrophic breakdown in coordination. Their replication processes faltered. The wave receded. The coalition survived, but it did not emerge unchanged. Its elders were forced to confront a truth they had long avoided. Their stability had become stagnation, their wisdom a shield against discomfort rather than a guide to growth. Humanity, young and scarred, had not saved them through superior knowledge or ancient foresight, but through a willingness to endure uncertainty and pain in pursuit of a future that was not guaranteed. In the aftermath, Klein was posthumously exonerated. His unauthorized rescue was reclassified as a necessary deviation. Monuments were erected not just to the fallen, but to the idea that had driven them. Humanity did not claim leadership of the coalition. It did not demand recognition as saviors. It continued to build ships that could be broken and repaired, to train crews who expected failure and survived it. Among the elder species, a new term entered common use, one that resisted direct translation. It referred to beings who did not seek perfect plans, who accepted loss without surrender, and who measured success not by the absence of risk, but by the persistence of effort. When they spoke of humanity, it was no longer as apprentices or cautionary tales. It was as a reminder that survival was not a static achievement, but a continuous act of defiance against entropy carried out by unyielding hands. In the years following the retreat of the constructs, the coalition attempted to catalogue what had changed. They had always believed that survival was a problem of equilibrium, that the universe rewarded those who minimized extremes and avoided unnecessary strain. Humanity had demonstrated something else entirely, a mode of endurance that thrived not by avoiding stress, but by metabolizing it. The elder species struggled to describe this in their frameworks. Their models required stable parameters, and humanity seemed to exist as a moving target, redefining itself through contact with adversity. What unsettled them most was that humans did not appear exceptional by their own reckoning. They spoke of their actions as obvious, even mundane, drawing parallels to disasters, wars, and recoveries from their own past. To the coalition, this was deeply troubling. If such behavior was ordinary, then the universe might be far less predictable than they had believed. Human space bore the scars of the conflict more visibly than most regions. Where coalition worlds favored pristine restoration, humanity rebuilt around damage, incorporating lessons rather than erasing evidence. Shipyards displayed fractured hull segments mounted as instructional tools. Habitats preserved entire sections of impact damage, not as memorials alone, but as reminders of structural limits. Children grew up seeing the marks of survival integrated into daily life. The coalition found this morbid. Humans found it practical. The next point of tension arose not from an external threat, but from governance. The coalition maintained a system of adjudication that prioritized long-term stability over localized justice. In disputes between member species, outcomes were often delayed, diluted, or deferred until they posed no risk to systemic balance. Humanity had accepted this framework initially, seeing it as a reasonable compromise among vastly different civilizations. After the war, patience wore thin. Human colonies on the frontier began to experience pressure from neighboring species seeking to reclaim territory lost during the chaos. These claims were backed by coalition precedent, citing ancient accords and demographic projections. The humans living there, many of whom had lost family during the fighting, were not inclined to wait centuries for resolution. One such colony orbited a red dwarf star with violent flare cycles that would have discouraged most species. Humans had settled there precisely because of its hostility, developing adaptive shielding and agricultural systems that could recover quickly after radiation events. When a neighboring species petitioned the coalition to reassign the system, arguing that human occupation was inefficient and hazardous, the coalition convened a review. The preliminary recommendation favored reassignment, coupled with a gradual relocation of the human population to safer worlds. The human response was immediate and unified. They did not threaten rebellion or withdrawal. They simply refused. Colony leaders transmitted detailed records of their adaptations, their birth rates, their improvements in survivability metrics. They argued not from entitlement, but from demonstrated resilience. The system was hostile, they said, but hostility was not the same as uninhabitable. The coalition countered with projections showing that a single miscalculation could wipe out the colony. The humans agreed and stated that they had already survived several such miscalculations. When the coalition attempted to enforce the reassignment by limiting trade and access to shared infrastructure, humanity responded with an unexpected move. They opened their own logistical networks to non-coalition species, offering repair, refueling, and medical services without regard to alliance status. These services were not free, but they were accessible, flexible, and responsive. Species that had long felt marginalized by coalition bureaucracy found in humanity a partner willing to meet them where they were, rather than where policy dictated they should be. This parallel network grew rapidly. It was not a formal faction, lacking a name or centralized authority, but its influence was undeniable. Ships diverted from coalition hubs to human-run facilities where turnaround times were shorter and restrictions fewer. Information flowed more freely, unencumbered by layers of oversight. The coalition observed this with growing concern. Their power had never rested solely on force, but on being indispensable. Humanity was quietly challenging that assumption. Within human society, debates raged. There were those who feared overextension, who warned that humanity was repeating the mistakes of its own imperial past. Others argued that disengagement was impossible, that responsibility followed capability, whether one desired it or not. What united them was a shared rejection of enforced passivity. Humanity did not seek to dominate the coalition, but it would no longer accept decisions made entirely without regard for lived experience. The elder species convened a summit unlike any before. Rather than a ceremonial gathering on a neutral world, they requested a meeting within human space. The location chosen was a partially reconstructed orbital station, damaged during the war and deliberately left unfinished. Exposed structural elements and visible reinforcement frameworks were a stark contrast to the smooth, sealed environments preferred by most coalition members. The humans did not apologize for this. They explained that the station was operational, safe, and reflective of their priorities. If the coalition found it uncomfortable, that discomfort was itself informative. During the summit, the coalition elders presented a proposal. They acknowledged humanity's contributions and resilience and offered an expanded role within existing structures. Humanity would be granted greater representation, limited veto powers, and increased autonomy in frontier regions, provided it recommitted to coalition oversight and refrained from establishing independent networks that undermined collective authority. It was, by coalition standards, a generous concession. Human delegates listened carefully. They did not dismiss the offer outright. Instead, they asked a series of questions that revealed the underlying divergence in values. How would future threats be handled if coalition projections again favored retreat over engagement? What thresholds of acceptable loss would be applied, and who would bear them? How would voices from marginal systems be weighted against ancient accords? The coalition responded with assurances, frameworks, and principles. Humanity responded by pointing out that none of these guaranteed action when action was costly. The impasse might have continued indefinitely had it not been for an event that forced the issue. A cluster of stars near the coalition core experienced an unprecedented cascade failure. An ancient energy extraction lattice, considered perfectly stable by coalition engineers, began to collapse due to a combination of microfractures and unforeseen resonance effects. The failure propagated rapidly, threatening multiple inhabited systems. Coalition response protocols were activated, but they were designed for controlled degradation, not systemic collapse. Evacuation timelines stretched beyond survivable limits. Human sensors detected the anomaly almost immediately. Human analysts, accustomed to operating with incomplete data, recognized the signs of a runaway failure. They did not wait for coalition authorization. Human fleets redeployed at maximum speed, carrying modular stabilization units and crews trained for high-risk intervention. Their plan was crude by coalition standards, physically reinforcing key nodes, venting excess energy through sacrificial conduits, and manually adjusting systems that had not been touched in millennia. Coalition authorities protested, warning that interference could worsen the collapse. Humanity acknowledged the risk and proceeded anyway. The intervention was brutal and costly. Several human ships were lost, crews exposed to lethal radiation and extreme gravitational stresses. Yet the cascade slowed, then stopped. Entire systems were saved from sterilization. In the aftermath, the coalition faced a choice it could no longer avoid. Humanity had acted decisively without permission and had once again succeeded where established doctrine would have failed. To condemn the action would be to admit that their own protocols were insufficient. To endorse it would be to concede that their monopoly on wisdom was broken. The decision, when it came, was not framed as capitulation, but as evolution. The coalition announced a restructuring of its governance, introducing what it termed adaptive authority. Member species would be permitted, even encouraged, to act independently in crises where existing models proved inadequate, provided they shared data and outcomes openly. Humanity was cited as a primary example of this approach in action. Among humans, the announcement was met with muted satisfaction. There was no celebration, no sense of victory. The changes were welcome, but they were also overdue. Humanity had not sought validation, only the freedom to act according to hardened instincts. As decades passed, the coalition became something different from what it had been. It remained old, vast, and cautious, but it was no longer static. Younger species found pathways to influence earlier. Marginalized worlds gained advocates willing to accept risk on their behalf. The universe did not become safer, but it became more responsive. For humanity, the journey was far from over. New threats loomed beyond the horizon, and internal challenges tested cohesion and purpose. Yet there was a quiet confidence that had not existed before. Humans understood that survival was not a state granted by others, nor a reward for compliance. It was an ongoing process, shaped by choices made under pressure. The elder species, observing humanity's continued growth, began to revise their histories. In their records, the era of human integration was no longer marked as the absorption of a younger civilization into an ancient order. It was marked as the moment the coalition rediscovered a truth it had forgotten. That endurance was not the absence of fracture, but the capacity to keep going, even when the universe refused to cooperate. The coalition's adoption of adaptive authority did not erase centuries of habit, and the transition from rigid equilibrium to conditional improvisation was neither smooth nor universally welcomed. Among the elder species, there were those who viewed the change as an existential threat, not because humanity was dangerous, but because unpredictability was. Their civilizations had been shaped by the long memory of near-extinction events, and from those scars they had drawn a single overriding lesson. Survival depended on limiting variance. Humanity represented variance embodied, a civilization that seemed to generate uncertainty wherever it went and then thrive within it. To some, this was a strength worth emulating. To others, it was a destabilizing force that might undo millennia of careful balance. Within humanity, the pressure of expectation began to mount. Having proven capable under crisis, humans found themselves increasingly called upon when systems strained or assumptions failed. Coalition requests grew more frequent and less tentative. Where once human intervention had been an embarrassment quietly tolerated, it was now openly solicited. Frontier disputes, infrastructure failures, ecological collapses on marginal worlds all arrived with an unspoken addendum. Humans will know what to do. This reliance carried its own dangers. Humanity had not built itself to be a universal solution, and the strain of constant engagement threatened to hollow out the very adaptability that made it effective. The first serious internal reckoning occurred in the aftermath of an intervention on a water world whose orbital dynamics had been altered by a long-forgotten megastructure. The native species, aquatic and slow-breeding, faced rising tidal extremes that would drown their spawning grounds within a few generations. Coalition models suggested relocation as the only viable option. Humanity proposed a stabilization effort involving orbital mass redistribution and adaptive coastal engineering, a project fraught with uncertainty and risk. The coalition approved and human teams deployed. The project succeeded in its primary objective. Tidal forces were moderated, habitats preserved, and the native populations stabilized. but the cost was higher than anticipated. Several human crews were lost during high-risk maneuvers, and the psychological toll on survivors was severe. They had saved another species, but at the expense of lives that many felt had been taken for granted by coalition planners. The question began to circulate quietly within human circles. At what point did responsibility become exploitation? This question did not have an easy answer. Humanity had always defined itself through action, through the refusal to stand aside when something could be done. Yet there was a growing awareness that their willingness to accept loss was being incorporated into coalition calculus as a resource, something to be spent. Coalition analysts began to factor human intervention into their projections, assuming that high-risk scenarios could be mitigated by deploying those who tolerated risk best. It was not malice, but it was a form of dependency that threatened to reshape incentives. The debate came to a head during a human assembly convened across multiple systems via delayed link consensus, a method designed to ensure deliberation rather than reaction. Voices from core worlds, frontier colonies, and mobile fleets all contributed. Some argued that humanity needed to establish clearer boundaries to formalize when and how it would intervene. Others countered that formalization was the first step toward the same rigidity that plagued the coalition. The discussion was not about withdrawal, but about agency. Humanity did not want to become the coalition's shock absorber, absorbing impacts so others could remain comfortable. A compromise emerged, not as a doctrine but as a principle. Human intervention would be guided not by coalition request alone, but by mutual commitment. If humanity was to accept disproportionate risk, it would require genuine partnership, shared decision-making, and shared consequences. This was communicated to the coalition not as an ultimatum, but as a clarification. Humanity would continue to act, but not as a tool to preserve systems unwilling to change. The coalition's response was mixed. Some elder species welcomed the honesty, seeing in it an opportunity to recalibrate their own assumptions. Others bristled at what they perceived as conditional altruism. They argued that survival required sacrifices and that humanity, having demonstrated its capacity to endure loss, should accept that role. The tensions simmered, unresolved, until an event forced a more definitive confrontation. In a dense region near the coalition's historical heartlands, a series of stars began exhibiting anomalous behavior. Their output fluctuated erratically, disrupting navigation, communication, and life support systems across multiple worlds. Initial investigations suggested an external cause, a network of ancient devices buried within stellar cores, activated by a chain of events no longer fully understood. These devices appeared to be part of a long-abandoned defense system designed to destabilize stars in response to threats that no longer existed. The coalition had inherited this legacy without comprehending it fully, assuming that what had remained dormant for millions of years would continue to do so. As the anomalies intensified, coalition authorities faced a nightmare scenario. Deactivating the devices required operations within stellar environments, a task considered effectively impossible by coalition standards. Their technology favored distance and control, not proximity and brute adaptation. Evacuation was discussed, but the scale was unprecedented. Entire species would be displaced, cultural cores abandoned. The coalition hesitated, trapped between doctrines that no longer fit reality. Human scientists and engineers, when presented with the data, did not dismiss the challenge, but neither did they underestimate it. They saw parallels to earlier crises, to systems that failed not because they were poorly designed, but because they were never meant to be revisited. Human proposals involved direct insertion of specialized vessels into stellar atmospheres, using layered shielding, real-time adaptive control, and crews trained to operate under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Losses were expected. Success was not guaranteed. The coalition asked humanity to lead the effort. This time, the human response was not immediate acceptance. They requested full access to coalition archives regarding the device's origins, including records previously classified as destabilizing knowledge. They demanded joint command structures, with coalition representatives embedded not as overseers but as participants. Most controversially, they insisted that any decision to proceed include a shared acknowledgement of risk, with coalition species committing resources and personnel proportionate to the danger, rather than delegating it entirely to humans. The negotiations were tense. For some elder species, the idea of placing their own in such peril was anathema. They argued that humanity's physiology and psychology made it uniquely suited to such tasks, and that efficiency demanded specialization. Humanity countered that efficiency without shared cost bred complacency. In the end, necessity overruled pride. The coalition agreed to the terms. The operation that followed was unlike anything in coalition history. Mixed crews, human and non-human, trained together under accelerated timelines. Coalition personnel struggled initially with the human approach, which emphasized redundancy, manual override, and acceptance of partial failure. Humans, in turn, had to adapt to working with beings whose instincts recoiled from improvisation. The friction was real, but so was the learning. When the first vessels plunged into the stellar envelopes, the experience shattered long-held assumptions. Coalition shielding technologies, optimized for predictable radiation profiles, failed catastrophically under fluctuating conditions. Human vessels, less elegant but more forgiving, absorbed damage and continued functioning. Human crews made constant adjustments, sometimes operating systems in ways that violated original design principles. Coalition crew members, witnessing this, were forced to abandon their training and trust the humans' instincts. Some could not. Casualties mounted, not only from the environment but from hesitation. Yet progress was made. Devices were located, interfaces breached, and deactivation sequences initiated. The work was brutal, measured in minutes of survivability and kilometers of molten plasma. Several vessels were lost entirely, their final transmissions filled not with panic, but with procedural updates and hard data passed on to those still fighting. The human practice of treating even death as information unsettled coalition observers, but it saved lives. In the end, the stellar network was neutralized, the stars stabilized, the immediate crisis passed, the aftermath was transformative. Coalition personnel who had survived the operation returned changed, carrying with them a visceral understanding of risk that no simulation could convey. They spoke differently in councils, less certain, more attentive to outlier scenarios. Humanity, for its part, emerged with a clearer sense of its limits. The losses had been heavy, and the cost weighed deeply. There was pride in what had been accomplished, but no illusion that such efforts could be sustained indefinitely without consequence. The coalition formally acknowledged humanity's conditions for future intervention, embedding shared risk as a core principle of collective action. This was more than policy, it was a cultural shift. Decisions could no longer be made with the assumption that someone else would bear the worst of the consequences. Among humans, there was a quiet recalibration. The narrative of unbounded resilience gave way to a more nuanced understanding. Endurance was not infinite. Adaptability required recovery. Humanity began investing as much in rest, rotation, and long-term sustainability as it had in rapid response. They did not become cautious in the coalition sense, but they became deliberate. As the decades rolled on, the coalition's view of humanity continued to evolve. No longer simply the species that would do what others would not, humans were increasingly seen as those who would ask what others refused to ask, and insist on answers that accounted for reality rather than comfort. This did not make them universally liked, but it made them indispensable in a different way. The universe remained indifferent, vast, and hazardous. There were no final victories, no permanent solutions, but within that indifference, a new pattern had taken root. Survival was no longer framed as the preservation of static systems, but as the capacity of a diverse collective to respond honestly to change. Humanity had not taught the coalition how to be brave. It had reminded it how to be honest about fear and how to act anyway, not alone, but together, hands steady even as the ground shifted beneath them. The period that followed the stellar intervention came to be known among humans as the Long Exhale, though it was not a time of rest so much as a slow release of tension that had been held too tightly for too long. The coalition, still adjusting to the shock of shared vulnerability, began a process of institutional introspection that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Committees were dissolved, reformed, and in some cases abandoned entirely when it became clear that their primary function had been to preserve precedent rather than solve problems. Humanity watched this with cautious optimism. They had learned that change declared and change enacted were not the same thing, and that the space between them was where intentions often went to die. Human space, meanwhile, underwent its own transformation. The myth of inexhaustible resilience had been tempered by experience, and with that tempering came a deliberate effort to preserve what made adaptability possible. Rotational deployments became standard, ensuring that no single generation of crews carried the cumulative burden of crisis response. Psychological recovery was treated not as an afterthought, but as infrastructure, with entire habitats dedicated to decompression and reintegration. This focus was not born of softness, as some critics claimed, but of hard arithmetic. A species that burned itself out in service of others would eventually become useless to itself and everyone else. The coalition observed these developments with a mixture of admiration and unease. There was a growing realization that humanity's strength did not lie in any single trait, but in the feedback loop between failure and reform. Where coalition systems sought to eliminate error, human systems anticipated it, budgeted for it, and learned from it. This difference became starkly apparent during a crisis that did not involve external threats or failing machines, but something far more difficult to quantify: trust. A mid-tier coalition species, one whose worlds lay along a major transit corridor, was accused of manipulating navigational data to siphon trade through its own systems. The practice was subtle, spread over decades, and when discovered, the species' leadership claimed ignorance, blaming legacy algorithms and outdated infrastructure. Coalition law treated such cases with extreme caution. Accusations that threatened economic stability were often buried under layers of investigation until their relevance faded. Humanity, whose merchants and transport fleets had been disproportionately affected, demanded a faster response. The coalition proposed a review period spanning several decades. Humanity countered with a different approach. Rather than litigating intent, they focused on impact. Human analysts compiled a transparent, publicly accessible record of altered routes, delays, and economic losses, presented not as an indictment, but as a shared problem. They invited the accused species to participate in the analysis, to see the effects in real time. This was not how coalition disputes were handled. It bypassed formal hierarchies and exposed vulnerabilities that many preferred to keep abstract. The accused species reacted defensively at first, perceiving the process as an attempt at humiliation. But as the data accumulated, patterns emerged that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The manipulation had not been centrally directed, but it had been tolerated, even encouraged, by mid-level authorities who benefited from incremental advantage. The coalition's traditional response would have been sanctions or enforced oversight. Humanity proposed something else: joint remediation. Human engineers offered to work alongside the species, own technicians to audit and redesign navigational systems, embedding safeguards that prevented similar exploitation in the future. In return, the species agreed to compensate affected parties through structured trade concessions rather than punitive fines. The process was messy, public, and uncomfortable. Mistakes were acknowledged openly, not smoothed over. In the end, the corridor stabilized, trust partially restored not through decree, but through shared effort. This episode had ripple effects throughout the coalition. It demonstrated that accountability did not have to be synonymous with punishment, and that transparency, while destabilizing in the short term, could strengthen systems over time. Humanity's role in this was noted, and not without resentment. There were those who accused humans of moral grandstanding, of imposing their own cultural biases under the guise of practicality. Humanity responded not with argument, but with consistency. They applied the same standards to their own networks, inviting external audits and exposing inefficiencies that cost them materially. The message was implicit. This was not about control, but about function. As the coalition adapted, so too did the challenges it faced. Beyond the known regions, beyond even the territories once threatened by the constructs, signals began to appear that defied existing classification. They were not coordinated, nor did they represent a unified entity. Instead, they suggested a scattering of civilizations at various stages of collapse or transformation, their emissions fragmented and irregular. Coalition analysts debated whether these were remnants of long-dead species or something else entirely. The question of intervention arose once more, but this time the calculus was different. Human exploratory groups were dispatched not as rescuers, but as observers with discretion. They were instructed to prioritize understanding over action, to resist the impulse to fix what they did not yet comprehend. This restraint was difficult for many, but it reflected the lessons of the previous decades. Not every problem could be solved through immediate engagement, and not every crisis was a call to sacrifice. Adaptability included knowing when to wait. One such expedition encountered a civilization in the late stages of planetary decline. Their star was entering a volatile phase, and their technology, once advanced, had stagnated under the weight of rigid doctrine. They had detected coalition signals long ago, but had chosen isolation, convinced that external contact would hasten their demise. When humans made contact, it was cautious and indirect, offering information rather than aid. The civilization's leaders responded with suspicion, interpreting the gesture as a prelude to assimilation or abandonment. Human emissaries did not press. They shared models of stellar behavior, projections of possible futures, and accounts of humanity's own failures and recoveries. They did not promise salvation. They did not conceal the risks. Over time, a dialogue emerged, slow and fragile. The civilization began to experiment tentatively with adaptations they had long forbidden. Some succeeded, many did not. Humanity remained present, not as saviors, but as witnesses and partners in uncertainty. This approach baffled many in the coalition. Why invest resources without a clear objective or guarantee of success? Humanity's answer was characteristically unsatisfying to those seeking certainty, because presence mattered, because abandonment was a choice, and so was patience. Because survival, as they had learned, was not a single event, but a series of decisions made under imperfect conditions. The consequences of this philosophy became apparent generations later, when fragments of that civilization, transformed and hardened by loss, re-emerged as a mobile culture adapted to stellar instability. They did not join the coalition formally, nor did they align themselves exclusively with humanity, but when crises arose in volatile regions, they appeared, offering hard-won expertise. They credited humanity not with saving them, but with refusing to decide their fate for them. Back within coalition space, a subtle shift occurred in how power was perceived. Authority was no longer solely a function of age or accumulated precedent. It began to be associated with responsiveness, with the ability to acknowledge error and adjust course. Humanity did not dominate councils, but their influence was evident in the questions being asked, the assumptions being challenged. Elder species found themselves re-examining long-held beliefs, not because humans demanded it, but because reality increasingly did. There were, inevitably, points of friction. Not all species welcomed the erosion of rigid hierarchy. Some withdrew from collective initiatives, retreating into insular policies that prioritized internal stability above all else. Humanity did not pursue them, nor did the coalition force compliance. The universe was large enough to accommodate different philosophies, and coercion had proven a poor teacher. What mattered was that alternatives now existed, visible and viable. For humanity, the challenge became one of balance. Their reputation as adaptable problem solvers threatened to eclipse their identity as a people with their own needs and aspirations. Cultural movements arose that emphasized art, local tradition, and continuity, pushing back against the narrative that humanity existed primarily to respond to crisis. This was not a rejection of responsibility, but a reassertion of humanity as more than a function within a larger system. The coalition, observing this, began to understand something it had long overlooked. Humanity's strength did not come from an obsession with survival alone, but from the richness of the life they were trying to preserve. Adaptability was not an abstract virtue. It was rooted in attachment, in the refusal to reduce existence to metrics and projections. Humans fought not because they were fearless, but because there were things they were unwilling to lose. As the era drew on, the coalition's historical records were updated once more. The integration of humanity was no longer framed as a turning point defined by war or catastrophe, but as a gradual reorientation of values. It marked the moment when survival ceased to be treated as a static condition and was recognized as an ongoing relationship with an unpredictable universe. Humanity did not claim credit for this shift. They continued to build, to argue among themselves, to make mistakes and correct them. They remained flawed, impatient, and prone to overreach, but they had learned to pair their willingness to act with a willingness to reflect, to accept that endurance required not just strength, but care. In the vastness of space, where civilizations rose and fell without witness, that combination proved rare. The coalition, older and wiser in ways humanity was not, began to see in their younger member not a mirror of their past, but a possible future. One in which survival was not hoarded behind layers of caution, but shared through honest engagement with risk, carried forward by unyielding hands that knew when to grip tightly and when to let go. Time in interstellar space did not pass evenly. There were eras dense with consequence and others that stretched thin, marked more by maintenance than by memory. The coalition entered one such thin era after the long reorientation, a period where no singular catastrophe demanded unity and no grand revelation forced change. For the elder species, this was a return to comfort. For humanity, it was something more difficult, a test of whether adaptability could survive without constant pressure. The danger was not stagnation, but drift. Human networks, built for responsiveness, now had to justify themselves in a quieter universe. Budgets were debated. Fleets once designed for rapid redeployment found themselves reassigned to patrols and infrastructure support. Younger generations, born after the great interventions, inherited stories of sacrifice without the visceral understanding of necessity. Some questioned why humanity continued to structure itself around preparedness for extremes that might never return. Others argued that vigilance was a cultural inheritance, not a reaction to fear, but an expression of responsibility. These debates were not confined to humanity. Within the coalition, a similar tension emerged. Adaptive authority had reshaped governance, but it had not erased the gravitational pull of precedent. There were elders who longed for the predictability of the old models, who viewed the current era as an aberration that would eventually correct itself. They pointed to the absence of existential threats as evidence that restraint, not risk, had been vindicated all along. Humanity listened, recognizing the argument because they had made it themselves in earlier centuries. The fracture line appeared in an unexpected domain, artificial ecology. A coalition initiative sought to standardize biosphere management across member worlds, introducing a set of optimized ecological templates designed to maximize stability and resource yield. These templates were based on extensive modeling and had been tested on uninhabited systems with impressive results. The coalition proposed gradual adoption, beginning with frontier worlds whose native ecosystems were considered inefficient or fragile. Human ecologists raised concerns immediately, not because the templates were flawed, but because they were complete. They left little room for spontaneous adaptation, relying instead on constant correction to maintain balance. Human experience with ecosystems, from Earth to hostile exoplanets, suggested that resilience often emerged from redundancy, diversity, and even apparent inefficiency. A system that required perpetual oversight, they argued, was stable only so long as the oversight never failed. The coalition responded with data, projections, and assurances. The probability of oversight failure was vanishingly small. Humanity countered with history. They cited examples not as anomalies but as patterns, moments when unlikely failures cascaded precisely because systems had been designed to exclude variance. The disagreement was civil, but it cut deep, touching on the fundamental question of whether control or tolerance was the better hedge against uncertainty. When a pilot implementation began on a marginal human colony without full human consent, tensions escalated. The colony, a world with erratic climate cycles and a patchwork biosphere shaped by decades of incremental adaptation, experienced short-term gains under the new template. Crop yields increased. Weather stabilized. Coalition observers declared the experiment a success. Human settlers, however, noticed subtler changes. Species that had survived extremes began to decline. Soil structures grew uniform, less capable of absorbing shock. The system was smoother, but also thinner. Then came the disruption. A stellar flare, stronger than projected but well within historical variance, struck the system. The standardized biosphere, optimized for equilibrium, lacked the buffers that had once absorbed such events. Collapse was rapid and widespread. Coalition response teams moved to restore the template, but each correction introduced new instabilities. Humanity intervened, not by repairing the system as designed, but by dismantling large portions of it, reintroducing chaotic elements that coalition engineers considered regressions. The recovery was messy and incomplete, but it worked. The biosphere did not return to its previous state, nor did it conform to coalition ideals. It became something else entirely, rougher, more redundant, less efficient, and far more resilient. The incident became a case study debated across the coalition. It forced an uncomfortable realization: optimization for stability could, under certain conditions, amplify fragility. This lesson resonated beyond ecology. It echoed in economic systems, information networks, and even cultural exchange. The coalition began to see a pattern in humanity's objections. They were not resisting progress or coordination, but warning against completeness, against systems so refined that they left no room for the unexpected. Humanity was not advocating disorder, but incompleteness as a feature rather than a flaw. As these ideas circulated, a new challenge emerged from within humanity itself. A movement arose that argued humanity had overcorrected, that its identity had become too entangled with being the coalition's conscience and contingency. They claimed that constant engagement with others' problems diluted humanity's own cultural trajectory. The movement was not isolationist, but inward-looking, advocating a period of deliberate disengagement to rediscover what humanity was when it was not reacting to crisis. The coalition watched this development with concern, interpreting it as a possible prelude to withdrawal. Humanity, aware of this perception, made a rare and deliberate choice: transparency. Human representatives openly discussed the movement's arguments in coalition forums, framing them not as a threat, but as a symptom of growth. A civilization, they argued, could not remain defined solely by its most extreme moments. If humanity was to continue contributing meaningfully, it needed space to evolve internally. The coalition's response was tentative but respectful. For the first time, a major member species requested a partial reduction in obligations without invoking emergency or conflict. The coalition agreed, adjusting expectations and redistributing responsibilities. Other species, observing this, began to consider similar recalibrations. The idea that participation could be dynamic rather than absolute took hold. During this period of relative quiet, a discovery was made that would have once triggered immediate alarm. In a region long considered inert, ancient megastructures were detected, not dormant defenses or extractive systems, but archives. They contained fragmented records of civilizations that had faced extinction-level events and chosen radical paths of adaptation. Some had transformed themselves biologically, others had dispersed into non-local forms of existence. Many had failed. The records were incomplete, biased, and often contradictory. The coalition convened to decide how to handle the archives. The old instinct was to restrict access, fearing misinterpretation or destabilizing knowledge. Humanity argued for openness, with context and caution rather than prohibition. They did not claim that the knowledge would be used wisely, only that ignorance guaranteed repetition. The debate was long and fraught, but in the end, the archives were shared, accompanied by collaborative analysis across species. What emerged from the study was not a blueprint for survival, but a humbling perspective. There was no single path that guaranteed continuity. Civilizations endured not by discovering a perfect solution, but by remaining capable of change even when change threatened identity itself. Some transformations were irreversible, some costs could not be justified in hindsight. Survival, the archives suggested, was not a moral outcome. It was simply what happened when enough decisions aligned with reality rather than desire. This realization deepened the coalition's appreciation for humanity's approach. Humans did not claim moral superiority for surviving. They did not romanticize endurance. They treated it as labor, as work that had to be done repeatedly, imperfectly, and without assurance of success. Their refusal to finalize systems, to close the book on adaptation, now appeared less like recklessness and more like humility. As the thin era stretched on, punctuated by minor crises and incremental reforms, the coalition settled into a new equilibrium, one that was paradoxically less rigid. Humanity did not lead this change alone, nor did it remain at the center of every development. Its influence was diffuse, embedded in processes and assumptions rather than directives. This suited humanity well. They had learned that being indispensable was a burden, and that the healthiest systems were those that could function without any single point of failure. In human space, art, philosophy, and local experimentation flourished alongside continued preparedness. Stories shifted in tone. Heroes were no longer defined solely by sacrifice in catastrophe, but by patience, by maintenance, by the quiet refusal to let systems decay. This was not a retreat from resilience, but an expansion of it. The universe remained vast and unconcerned. New uncertainties waited beyond the horizon, and old ones resurfaced in altered forms. But humanity and the coalition now faced them with a shared understanding that the goal was not to build something that would never break, but something that could be broken and still endure. In that understanding lay a fragile, hard-won confidence, not the confidence of mastery, but of participation in a reality that could not be controlled, only engaged. Humanity had not taught the coalition how to survive forever. It had taught it how to keep going without pretending that forever was guaranteed. The coalition did not mark the end of the thin era with ceremony. There was no singular event that announced its passing, no catastrophe or revelation to draw a clean boundary between before and after. Instead, the change announced itself through accumulation, through small failures that were handled without panic and modest successes that were not overinterpreted. The universe, indifferent as ever, simply presented a new configuration of pressures, and the coalition, altered by decades of recalibration, met them differently than it would have once. The first sign was subtle enough that many missed it. Along several peripheral regions, communication latency began to increase in irregular patterns. At first, this was attributed to routine interference, the sort of background noise that accompanied any sufficiently large network. Human signal analysts, however, noticed something off. The delays were not random. They clustered around regions of low activity, areas that should have been quiet. The pattern suggested not degradation, but interference with intent, as if something were gently but persistently nudging information aside. Coalition models struggled to incorporate the anomaly. There was no hostile signature, no energy expenditure consistent with known forms of manipulation. The phenomenon did not damage infrastructure or interrupt traffic outright. It merely introduced uncertainty, forcing rerouting, recalculation, and delay. For a coalition accustomed to predictability, this was deeply unsettling. Systems that relied on precise timing began to desynchronize. Minor inefficiencies compounded. Nothing failed catastrophically, but nothing ran smoothly either. Human observers framed the issue differently. They did not ask what the interference was, but what it did. It eroded confidence in centralized coordination. It made long chains of dependency brittle. It favored systems that could operate semi-independently, that could tolerate incomplete information and still function. In other words, it punished the coalition's remaining rigidity and rewarded the adaptations it had begun, but not yet fully embraced. The question of response exposed how far the coalition had come. In earlier eras, the instinct would have been containment or suppression, an attempt to eliminate the anomaly before its nature was fully understood. This time, the initial response was observation paired with decentralization. Authority was deliberately diffused. Regional nodes were empowered to act autonomously within broad parameters. Humanity advocated for this not as an experiment, but as a necessity. If the interference could not be removed, systems would have to be shaped to live with it. As this approach unfolded, something unexpected happened. The interference intensified in regions that clung to centralized control, while becoming almost irrelevant in areas that embraced local autonomy. It was as if the phenomenon itself was indifferent to scale, but responsive to structure. The coalition began to suspect that it was not being attacked in a conventional sense, but tested. The idea was uncomfortable. The notion that something in the universe might probe for weakness not through force, but through subtle pressure ran counter to centuries of coalition experience. Yet the evidence mounted. The interference did not escalate into destruction. It persisted, adjusted, and waited. Humanity, drawing on both intuition and historical analogy, suggested a possibility that many elders resisted. This was contact, not conquest. The coalition's first attempt at communication was cautious and formal, encoded messages broadcast across affected regions, offering exchange and inquiry. There was no response. Humanity proposed a different tactic, one that bypassed direct address entirely. They suggested altering behavior rather than messaging, restructuring networks in ways that reflected an understanding of the pressure being applied. If the phenomenon was responsive to structure, then structure itself might be the language. This was a radical proposal, not because it was dangerous, but because it required relinquishing the idea that communication had to be explicit. It demanded trust in pattern and response rather than declaration. After long debate, the coalition agreed to a limited trial. Human networks led the way, not by design, but by compatibility. Their systems were already fragmented, layered, and resilient to partial failure. They leaned into this, further decentralizing control, increasing redundancy, and allowing local nodes to make decisions that might once have been escalated. Other species followed suit to varying degrees, some reluctantly, others with curiosity. The result was not immediate clarity, but a gradual easing of pressure. Latency stabilized. Interference became predictable, then almost ignorable. In regions where adaptation lagged, the pressure remained. The pattern was unmistakable. The phenomenon was not hostile to existence, but to inflexibility. Eventually, a response came, not in words but in data. Embedded within the interference were fragments of structured information, not a language in any conventional sense, but a series of transformations applied to transmitted signals. Human analysts, accustomed to extracting meaning from noise, recognized the intent. This was a record, or perhaps a mirror, reflecting the coalition's own systems back at them, altered to highlight points of strain. The entity behind the phenomenon never identified itself. It did not present demands or offer alliance. It demonstrated, repeatedly and patiently, that systems which could not tolerate uncertainty would be reshaped by it, whether they wished to be or not. In this, humanity saw a familiar truth. The universe had always operated this way. The difference now was awareness. The coalition did not attempt to classify the entity as friend or foe. Those categories felt inadequate. Instead, it acknowledged the encounter as a lesson delivered through existence rather than intention. There was a quiet consensus, unspoken but shared, that this was not a singular intelligence so much as an expression of a broader principle, one that had likely shaped countless civilizations before. In reflecting on the encounter, the coalition's historical councils reached an unprecedented conclusion. The greatest threat they had ever faced was not extinction by force, but irrelevance through rigidity. Civilizations that could not change did not need to be destroyed. They simply failed to matter to a universe that continued without them. Humanity's role in this realization was undeniable, but it was not celebrated. There were no monuments, no declarations of vindication. Humans themselves were uneasy with the implication that their way of being aligned so closely with a universal pressure. They knew their adaptability had limits, that their resilience was contingent, not absolute. The encounter did not make them feel superior. It made them feel observed. In the years that followed, the coalition underwent its most profound transformation yet. Membership was no longer defined solely by treaties and borders, but by participation in a shared practice of adaptation. Some species withdrew, choosing stability over engagement. Others emerged from isolation, drawn by the possibility of a collective that did not promise safety, but offered relevance. Humanity found its place within this evolving whole not as a leader or exemplar, but as a contributor whose perspective had been forged through failure as much as success. They continued to argue, to err, to push against complacency. They also continued to step back when necessary, allowing others to act, to learn, to bear responsibility. The long arc of coalition history began to look different when viewed through this lens. The rise and fall of civilizations were no longer plotted as triumphs and tragedies, but as phases of responsiveness. Those that endured were not the strongest or the oldest, but those that remained engaged with a universe that offered no guarantees. For humanity, this understanding brought a quiet peace. They had spent generations defined by reaction, by crisis, by the need to prove that they belonged. Now, belonging was no longer contingent on performance. It was rooted in participation, in the willingness to remain unfinished. Children born in this era learned a different set of stories. Not tales of heroic last stands or singular victories, but accounts of maintenance crews keeping ancient systems running through ingenuity and patience, of negotiators admitting uncertainty and finding solutions in collaboration, of explorers turning back not in failure but in recognition of limits. These stories were not less inspiring. They were more sustainable. The universe did not grow kinder. Stars still died, systems still failed, life remained precarious, but within that precarity, a pattern persisted. Civilizations that accepted uncertainty as a condition rather than an enemy found ways to continue. Humanity, once the youngest voice in an ancient chorus, had helped the coalition remember this, not through dominance or wisdom, but through stubborn engagement with reality as it was. There was no final chapter to this story, no closing resolution that declared victory or permanence. Survival was not a destination. It was a practice, renewed daily, across worlds and species, carried forward by those willing to adapt without surrendering meaning. In the end, what the coalition learned from humanity was not how to endure the universe, but how to live within it without demanding that it be something else. That lesson, fragile and unfinished, was carried onward, not as doctrine, but as habit, shaped by countless unyielding hands that understood that to keep going was not a guarantee, but a choice made again and again in the face of uncertainty.